10 ships stopped, 0 shots fired. That is the ledger on one Arleigh Burke-class destroyer operating in the Strait of Hormuz right now. And the number that should not make sense is 0, not 10. This is a warship. It carries 96 vertical launch cells. It can put an SM-2 interceptor on a target at over 160 kilometers. It has a 5-inch deck gun and a phalanx close-in weapon system that fires 20 rounds per second. Every instrument aboard exists to project lethal force at range. And yet the tool that actually stopped 10 vessels, turned them around, sent them back, ended their transit without a single warning shot, was a boarding team with a tablet, a satellite uplink, and several days' worth of position data. The strangest part is not that it worked. The strangest part is that it worked 10 times in a row. So why is the most powerful piece of kit on that bridge wing not the Aegis radar, but the logbook? Stay with us, because the answer is not what the hardware suggests. To understand what is happening on the water right now, you have to start with the geography, because the geography is the whole argument. The Strait of Hormuz is roughly 33 miles wide at its narrowest point. 2 inbound lanes, 2 outbound lanes, each lane 2 miles across, separated by a median zone. That is it. Every tanker, every LNG carrier, every container ship that moves between the Persian Gulf and the open ocean passes through those 4 miles of usable lane. Roughly a fifth of the world's entire oil supply moves through that corridor on any given day. The volume runs somewhere in the range of 17 million barrels. At current market prices, that is a number that does not fit comfortably in a sentence. It is the kind of figure you put on a screen and let the viewer absorb. The point is that closing the strait, or even slowing it, does not require sinking a ship. It requires making insurance companies nervous enough that captains slow down and operators reroute. The economic damage begins before the first shot, if there ever is a shot. The US Navy has operated continuously in the Persian Gulf since the 1980s. The Fifth Fleet, headquartered in Bahrain, has maintained presence through the tanker war, through the first Gulf War, through 2 decades of post-9/11 operations, through successive rounds of Iranian nuclear negotiations and their collapses. The Arleigh Burke-class has been the backbone of that presence for 30 years. These are Flight IIA and Flight 3 destroyers, the most capable surface combatants the Navy operates at scale. Aegis Combat System, Spy-1D or SPY-6 radar, Tomahawk land attack missiles, anti-submarine warfare suites, and those 96 VLS cells that can carry an interchangeable mix of SM-2, SM-6, SM, and Tomahawk depending on the mission load. The current patrol operates under an enforcement posture that planners at the Pentagon put in place, incrementally, beginning with tightened sanctions enforcement and escalating through a series of IRGC provocations. Fast boat swarms, drone harassment of commercial shipping, the seizure of tankers in 2023 and 2024. The most recent phase began when the administration under Donald Trump reimposed maximum pressure sanctions and directed Fifth Fleet to actively enforce compliance, not merely observe it. That enforcement mission is where the destroyer's role becomes counterintuitive. Here is what nobody expected. The primary tool of enforcement would not be the weapons magazine, it would be the information advantage. Layer 1. What a shadow tanker actually is, and why it is vulnerable to paper rather than to shells. A shadow tanker is a vessel, typically an aging single-hull crude carrier, often registered under a flag of convenience in a jurisdiction that does not cooperate with Western sanctions enforcement, that moves sanctioned oil, usually Iranian crude, by disguising its origin and destination. The technique is not new. What has evolved is its sophistication. The standard playbook goes something like this. The vessel turns off its automatic identification system transponder, the maritime equivalent of a commercial aircraft squawking its tail number at some point in open ocean, usually somewhere in the northern Indian Ocean or the Gulf of Oman. It rendezvous with another vessel for a ship-to-ship transfer, sometimes in Iranian territorial waters where surveillance is contested, sometimes in international waters at night. It then turns the AIS back on with a falsified position history, showing it was somewhere else during the gap. It enters the strait with a manifest listing the cargo as originating from a non-sanctioned port bound for a compliant destination. On paper, clean. On paper, legal. The problem is that paper and reality diverge the moment the AIS goes dark, and that divergence leaves a trail. Satellite radar, synthetic aperture radar operated by commercial providers, not just military assets, can image vessels whether or not they are broadcasting AIS. Infrared satellite passes at night can detect engine heat signatures from vessels that are nominally not there. Cross-referencing those signatures against AIS broadcast histories produces what intelligence analysts call an AIS gap, a period during which a vessel was physically present somewhere other than where its transponder claimed it was. The surveillance architecture that makes this possible is genuinely new and worth pausing on. 5 years ago, the commercial satellite radar constellation was sparse enough that gaps of 12 to 18 hours in coverage were routine over stretches of the Gulf of Oman. A vessel could go dark, conduct a transfer, and re-emerge with a plausible alibi simply because no satellite had imaged that patch of water during the window. That has changed substantially. The commercial SAR providers, firms operating fleets of small radar satellites in low Earth orbit, have increased their revisit rates dramatically. Certain high-priority zones in the Gulf and the northern Indian Ocean now receive multiple SAR passes per day. The heat signature satellites add another layer. An anchored vessel with engines at idle still shows a thermal profile that distinguishes it from open water. Layer those two data streams over the AIS record, and the alibi window collapses from hours to minutes. A boarding team on a destroyer does not need a court order. Under international maritime law, a warship of a flag state can board a vessel of the same flag, and under certain conditions can board any vessel in international waters suspected of violating applicable law. The legal framework is dense and contested at the margins, but the practical authority is real and has been exercised consistently. The team boards. They pull the vessel's GPS logs. They check the engine room logs, which record fuel consumption and running hours, and cannot easily be falsified retroactively. They cross-reference the manifest against the satellite position data stored on the boarding team's system. And if the numbers do not reconcile, if the engine says the ship ran for 72 hours, but the AAS shows a 48-hour transit, the discrepancy is documented, flagged, and the vessel is instructed to return to its last declared port pending investigation. The boarding team's tablet carries a preloaded intelligence package assembled before departure from the destroyer. It includes not just the satellite imagery and AIS gap data, but a profile of the vessel itself, its ownership history, flag changes, previous boarding reports, if any, the names and nationalities of its registered crew, and a list of known associated entities cross-referenced against the OFAC designated persons database. By the time the team steps onto the deck, they already know which questions will be hardest to answer and which documents are most likely to be missing or inconsistent. That preparation is what allows a 2-person documentation team to work through a manifest in 40 minutes rather than 4 hours. The efficiency is not accidental. It is the product of years of iterative improvement in how intelligence packages are structured and delivered to tactical teams. Here's the part that does not make sense on the surface. The crew turns around. Not because they are under the guns of a destroyer, because the legal and commercial consequences of having that discrepancy in a documented boarding report are worse than the lost revenue on one cargo. The vessel owner faces port state control denials across every cooperating jurisdiction. The insurer faces liability exposure. The charterer faces sanctions designation. The paper is more devastating than a warning shot, because a warning shot can be protested, denied, and reframed as aggression. A documented AIS gap in a boarding report is just arithmetic. Layer 2. What the numbers actually look like on the cost side, because this is where the strategy gets interesting. One SM-2 Blockade interceptor, the standard medium-range air defense round in an Arleigh Burke-class magazine, runs approximately $2 million per unit. The SM-6, which handles the longer range and terminal defense role, runs over $4 million. A full VLS loadout on a Burke is not a fixed configuration, but a typical patrol mix in a contested environment might carry 30 to 40 interceptors of various types alongside Tomahawks and anti-submarine rockets. That is a magazine worth somewhere between $60 and $150 million sitting in the hull. A document-driven turnback costs a few hours of fuel, the crew time of a boarding team of roughly 8 personnel, and the satellite data subscription that feeds the AIS cross-reference system. The fuel cost for an Arleigh Burke running at moderate speed for a 6-hour boarding operation is somewhere around $50,000. The data overhead is negligible. The total cost per interdiction is orders of magnitude below the cost of a single fired round. That asymmetry is not an accident of circumstance. It is the structural logic of information-based enforcement. The expensive thing, the missile, is there to ensure that nobody tests the cheap thing. The cheap thing, the boarding, is what actually does the work. What strikes me about this dynamic is that it inverts the usual logic of deterrence. Deterrence theory says you need to threaten the expensive thing credibly enough that nobody forces you to use it. What the Hormuz boarding posture shows is something slightly different. If your cheap option works, the expensive option's credibility is reinforced precisely by never being tested. 10 ships turned back, 0 shots fired. Every vessel that complies makes the next one slightly more likely to comply because the record shows that the destroyer does not need to escalate to get results. But there is a constraint embedded in that logic, and it shapes everything else. Layer 3. What happens when a captain decides to test the cheap option? The boarding and document approach depends on a shared understanding, not an agreement, not a treaty, but a practical understanding that the consequences of non-compliance are real and enforceable. That understanding rests on two things: the legal framework that makes the boarding report actionable, and the visible presence of a warship that can escalate if the legal framework is ignored. Remove the second element and the first becomes advisory. This is the structural vulnerability that Iranian planners, and the IRGC Navy specifically, have studied carefully. The IRGC operates a fleet of fast attack craft. Small, fast, numerous, difficult to engage without creating the kind of incident that reverses the entire diplomatic calculus. A swarm of IRGC fast boats harassing a boarding operation does not give the destroyer a clean escalation option. Firing on fast boats in contested waters with commercial shipping in the lane and journalists' satellite phones recording everything is a decision with consequences that run well beyond the tactical situation. The destroyer knows this, the IRGC knows the destroyer knows this. The 10 ships that turned back were not escorted by fast boat swarms. They were commercial operators making a rational calculation about risk and exposure. The open question, the one that keeps planners awake, is what happens when a vessel is not a commercial operator making a rational calculation but an IRGC-directed asset making a political one. I spent time going through the documented incidents from 2023 and 2024, and one pattern kept nagging at me. Every time a vessel genuinely refused to comply with a boarding order, there was an IRGC asset in the vicinity within 2 to 4 hours. Not a coincidence, a response protocol. The IRGC does not need to be present at the moment of boarding to affect the outcome. It needs to arrive fast enough that the boarding team's window closes before the documentation is complete. In at least 2 documented cases from the 2024 enforcement period, boarding teams were aboard vessels when IRGC fast boats appeared on the radar horizon. The boarding teams completed their work and withdrew without incident. But the clock had been running, and everyone on both sides knew it. That is obstacle number 1 in this operation. The boarding window is finite, and the IRGC can compress it. The solution the Navy developed was not to extend the window, it was to move faster. Pre-positioned boarding packages, preloaded satellite data feeds, standardized documentation protocols that let a team complete the essential record in under 2 hours rather than 4. The result is a boarding posture that can execute and withdraw before the fast boat cavalry arrives most of the time. Most of the time is doing a lot of work in that sentence. Consider what the radar picture looks like from the destroyer's Combat Information Center. During a boarding operation, the VBSS team is on the target vessel. The destroyer itself is maintaining station at a distance that keeps it out of easy ambush range from the target's crew, while staying close enough to extract the team in under 10 minutes if the situation deteriorates. The Aegis radar is tracking everything within 200 kilometers. Surface contacts are being sorted by track number and cross-referenced against the AIS feed in real time. If an IRGC fast boat departs a known patrol base on the Iranian coast, the CIC watch team knows about it within minutes. The boarding team leader has a radio channel direct to the destroyer's bridge and a pre-agreed abort criterion. If a surface contact closes to within a defined range before documentation is complete, the team withdraws. Clean, rehearsed. Designed to avoid exactly the kind of ambiguous engagement that would end the entire enforcement posture. The discipline required to execute that abort, to leave a boarding incomplete rather than force a confrontation, is not something that comes naturally to people trained to close with and complete an objective. It is a learned institutional posture, and it represents a genuine evolution in how the Navy thinks about these operations. Layer 4. The Shadow Fleet Scale, and why 10 turnbacks is a real number but also a constrained one. The Shadow Fleet operating in the Gulf region is not a handful of vessels. Estimates from maritime intelligence firms, Windward, Vortaxa, the UN panel of experts on Iran, put the number of vessels engaged in regular sanctions evasion transits through or adjacent to the Hormuz corridor in the range of 200 to 300 active hulls at any given time. These are not all crude tankers. Some are LNG carriers, some are product tankers, some carry other sanctioned goods. But crude oil is the volume that matters, and the crude oil shadow fleet is large enough that 10 turnbacks, while real and significant, represents a fraction of total traffic. This is not a criticism of the operation, it is the arithmetic of scale. A single destroyer, or even a 3-ship surface action group, cannot interdict every vessel in a fleet of hundreds. The selection logic matters as much as the execution. What the boarding team targets is the vessel most likely to produce a complete, documentable, legally actionable AS gap, the vessel whose paper trail is weakest, whose flag state is most cooperative, whose charterer is most exposed to secondary sanctions. The deterrent effect does not come from catching every violator. It comes from making the risk detection high enough, and the consequences specific enough, that the marginal operator recalculates. Put yourself in the position of a shipping company operating in the gray zone, not a designated sanctions violator, but a company that has been doing business with entities that are. You get one boarding report filed against one of your vessels. That report goes to the Office of Foreign Assets Control. Your P&I club, your maritime insurer, gets a copy. Every port state control authority in the EU, the UK, and the US gets flagged. You are not yet designated, but your next cargo booking gets a phone call from your insurer asking questions. Your next port call gets a secondary inspection request from customs. Your correspondent bank starts asking about your compliance program. The boarding report did not sink your ship. It made operating in that space expensive enough that you move your business somewhere else. What happens to the crews of vessels that are turned back is a dimension of this story that rarely gets coverage, and it is worth slowing down on. The men who work aboard shadow tankers, and they are almost entirely men drawn heavily from the Philippines, India, Pakistan, and Indonesia, are not in most cases the architects of the scheme they are participating in. They are seafarers working for manning agencies that supply labor to vessel operators, often without full visibility into who the ultimate beneficial owner of the vessel is or what cargo it is actually carrying. A Filipino able seaman on a 20-year-old Panamanian-flagged crude carrier in the Gulf of Oman is unlikely to have had much say in whether that vessel's AIS transponder went dark 3 days ago off the coast of Bandar Abbas. When a vessel is turned back, the crew faces an uncertain transit back to a port that may or may not pay their wages on time, may or may not hold their passports, and may or may not be safe to arrive in given the circumstances of the turnback. The International Transport Workers Federation has documented cases where crews of turnback shadow tankers were abandoned by vessel operators within weeks of an enforcement action, the operator dissolving the shell company that held the vessel's registration and walking away from sewage obligations entirely. The legal tools to pursue those wages across jurisdictions are slow, expensive, and often unavailing. The enforcement system is designed to create consequences for the operator, the charterer, and the financier. It is less well designed to protect the crew that was caught in the middle. That gap is not a secret. It is a known tension in the sanctions enforcement architecture, and it is the human reality that sits underneath the clean arithmetic of AIS gap detection. That is the mechanism. That is why the logbook beats the gun in this context, not because force is absent, but because force is the backstop that makes the logbook credible, while the logbook does the actual work of changing behavior at scale. Here is the take that will probably get us some pushback. The paperwork and patience approach is tactically brilliant and strategically incomplete. The 10 turnbacks represent a real enforcement record. The AIS gap methodology is genuinely sophisticated and genuinely effective against commercial operators making commercial calculations, but the shadow fleet has not shrunk. Iranian crude exports have not collapsed. The vessels that are most committed, the ones operating for the IRGC directly, the ones whose owners are already designated and have nothing to lose from another boarding report, are largely not the ones being turned back. They are the ones with fast boat escorts and Iranian territorial water options. The enforcement posture works on the population it can reach, the gray zone commercial operator. It is less effective, by design, against the hardened violator who is already priced in designation. And the hardened violator is the one moving the volume that matters most to Iranian oil revenues. There is a secondary layer to this strategic incompleteness that the public debate rarely engages with directly. The commercial network supporting the shadow fleet, the ship managers in Dubai, the cargo brokers in Hong Kong, the insurers in Moscow and Kuala Lumpur, who have stepped into the gap left by the London market's withdrawal, has proven remarkably adaptive. Each time a category of vessel or a specific flag registry gets flagged as high risk by Western enforcement agencies, the network routes around it. Vessels reflag. Ownership chains lengthen. New manning agencies appear in jurisdictions that do not share crew data with Western databases. The enforcement apparatus is always working against last year's network topology because the network updates faster than the legal instruments that chase it. What do you think? Is paper and patience the right lever for this kind of enforcement, or does it need a visible escalation option to close the gap on the operators who have nothing left to lose? That question is genuinely open, and it is the question that Fifth Fleet planners are working through right now. The human cost in this kind of operation does not look like casualties. It looks like something quieter and harder to quantify. A boarding team on an Arleigh Burke works in cycles that run against every natural rhythm. The Strait does not pause for weather or for fatigue or for the fact that the team has done 3 boardings in 72 hours. The vessels move on commercial schedules, which means they transit at night as often as in daylight. A nighttime boarding onto a vessel of unknown internal configuration, with a crew of unknown disposition, in waters where fast boats can appear on the radar at any moment is not a routine operation even when it becomes routine. The Arleigh Burke-class destroyer conducting these operations carries a crew of somewhere between 280 and 330, depending on the specific hull and fit. The boarding team is typically a detachment from the ship's own crew supplemented by naval boarding and vessel search and seizure specialists, VBSS teams trained for exactly this. What the training does not fully prepare for is the sustained tempo of operations in a contested environment where every boarding is simultaneously a legal proceeding, a tactical operation, and a geopolitical signal. The individual sailors who rotate through VBSS duty on a Gulf deployment carry a cognitive load that is difficult to describe without sounding melodramatic, but it is real and it accumulates. Before each boarding, the team leader conducts a brief that covers the vessel's layout, the crew's nationalities and last port of call, the specific documents they are targeting, the abort criteria, and the communications plan. That brief is formal and rehearsed. What it cannot cover is the variable that matters most in a close quarters boarding, the disposition of the master. Some masters are cooperative, even relieved. They are employees of a vessel operator they may themselves distrust, and a US Navy boarding gives them a documented record that is not their fault. Some masters are hostile in ways that stop short of physical resistance, using delays and document confusion and language barriers to run out the clock. Some are genuinely frightened. Crew members who have never had a warship come alongside before and do not know what to expect. Reading that room, in real time, aboard a vessel you have never been on, in a language that is probably not yours, with a radar contact potentially closing on the horizon, that is the actual skill the VBSS team is deploying. It is not a skill that shows up in any weapon specification. The crew of a destroyer on a Gulf patrol rotation is away from home for 7 to 8 months. The operations tempo in the current enforcement posture runs higher than a standard patrol. The maintenance demands on an Arleigh Burke running at operational speed in the Gulf, the heat, the salt, the high cycle demand on propulsion and radar, are substantial. The Navy has been managing a readiness backlog in its surface fleet that is a matter of public record. The Government Accountability Office has documented surface ship maintenance delinquencies that run into the billions. The destroyer doing the boarding work is the same destroyer that would need to launch SM-2s if the situation escalated. Its readiness for both missions is not independent. The hours spent on boarding operations are hours not spent on training for high-end warfare. The trade is deliberate and accepted, but it is a trade. Most people assume that the Navy's presence in the Gulf is primarily about being ready for a large-scale fight, and in one sense it is. But the evidence from the last 2 years suggests that the actual work is something more granular and more exhausting. Constant low-level enforcement, constant information gathering, constant presence maintenance that signals intent without triggering the escalation everyone is trying to avoid. The carrier strike group as floating threat is only part of the picture. The other part is a boarding team at 0200 in the Strait, working through a manifest in a language they did not learn at school, with a radar contact 3 hours away and closing. Now close the loop. Because the paradox from the first 30 seconds, why does the most dangerous ship in the Strait use a logbook instead of a gun, has an answer, and it is not what the hardware suggests. The Arleigh Burke-class destroyer is the most capable surface combatant in the world at its scale. Its weapon systems are not decoration. The SM-2 and SM-6 interceptors have been fired in anger against Houthi ballistic missiles and drone swarms in the Red Sea corridor, and they have worked. The Phalanx Suez has engaged terminal threats. The capability is real and exercised, but capability and application are different questions. The question in the Strait is not whether the destroyer can sink a tanker, it obviously can. The question is whether sinking a tanker achieves the objective. The objective is not to remove a single vessel from the water. The objective is to change the behavior of a fleet of hundreds of vessels, operated by dozens of companies, financed by a network of banks and insurers, across a sustained period measured in months and years. A kinetic action achieves none of that. A kinetic action creates an incident that dominates the narrative, forces a legal and diplomatic response, and gives every gray zone operator a reason to claim victim status rather than calculate exposure. The logbook works because it is precise. It reaches the specific vessel, documents the specific violation, creates the specific legal record that travels through the specific commercial network and produces specific consequences for the specific actors who made the specific decision to transit. It is slow, it is labor-intensive, it does not make for dramatic footage, but it is the instrument that actually moves behavior at scale. The gun is what makes the logbook credible. The logbook is what makes the gun unnecessary, so far. Here is where both levers carry a price, and neither is clean. The boarding and document approach works until a committed actor decides to test it, and the response to a genuine test requires the destroyer to either escalate or concede. Escalation ends the careful equilibrium that has kept 10 boardings incident-free. Concession ends the deterrent value of the entire posture. There is no path between those outcomes that does not cost something. A warning shot, the alternative approach, collapses that decision tree faster. It signals unmistakably that the boundary is enforced and the cost of crossing it is immediate and physical. It ends the argument. It also invites every jurisdiction that benefits from shadow fleet operations to reframe the confrontation as US aggression, gives Tehran a propaganda tool it does not currently have, and risks a fast boat response that escalates faster than anyone planned. Both options carry a price. The fleet has chosen the slower, more precise option for 10 interdictions running. What it has not faced yet is the interdiction that does not comply. Will the next vessel be the one that tests the limit? Comment yes or no. We read everyone. One detail that stuck with me after going through the boarding reports in the AAS gap data. The vessels that turn around most quickly are not the ones with the most obviously falsified documentation. They are the ones with the best documentation. Carefully constructed paper trails that are technically defensible but commercially ruinous to defend in a boarding context. The operator who spent the most money building the cover story is the one who folds first, because folding preserves the cover story for next time. The operator with nothing to lose takes longer. That asymmetry tells you something about the nature of enforcement in this environment that no weapon system specification captures. The deterrent is not firepower. The deterrent is the cost calculus, and the destroyer's job is to hold that calculus stable long enough for the commercial network to adjust. 10 ships turn back. The logbook still holds. The question the fleet cannot answer in advance is how long it holds, and what the answer looks like when it does not. The next time you see an Arleigh Burke in the news, and you will, because the Strait does not quiet down, ask which instrument it is actually using. The answer tells you more about naval power in this era than the weapons loadout ever could. If you want to understand how the same destroyer handles the situation when the logbook fails, when the boarding turns into something the paper cannot resolve, that is a different conversation, and we will have it. Subscribe so you are there when we do.